if the sun is getting you, please feel free to move. We want to keep you healthy. Drink water. Follow the shade. This is the great Advent movement. It's okay to move. What is our theme for the year? His word, our strength. And where do we have His word? Right here. What is your least favorite text in this word? Because I can tell you what mine used to be when I was a Pathfinder back in Lincoln, Nebraska a few years ago. Ephesians 6:1. Anybody got it in their head? Oh, you just ignored it. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is good. I was sort of born with those genes that didn't want to do what Mama said or Daddy said. In fact, if they said do it, then I sort of wanted to not do it, or if they said don't do it, then I sort of felt like I had to do it. And I didn't like that word from the Lord. But that word from the Lord has a purpose. Because for the most part, and I will be the first to admit that there are parents who do not follow the Lord, and they do not read the next verse that says, parents, do not provoke your children to wrath. They just take that first part, you must obey me, but I don't have to be fair or decent. Most parents are wonderfully fair and decent and loving. That would be our desire. But there's a reason why God asked us and even made it a commandment. Which commandment is it? The 5th commandment. Honor your mother and your father. It's the only one with the promise, and the promise is
so your days may be
that you
long.
may live long and prosper. I like the idea that we're dealing with the Amazon in our meetings in the big tent. And so I'm going to stay with that theme today very quickly, and I want to tell you about Ramon, because I was lucky enough to live in the jungles of Peru for 5 years, where my husband was a mission pilot. We were almost on the border of Brazil, but we were still where they primarily spoke Spanish, and then about 19 Indian dialects that were much more closely related to Chinese and Japanese and the Far Eastern languages than they were to Spanish, which was very interesting. So we would have to get translators for Shipibo and Campa and the other tribes that were there. But Ramon lived way out in the jungle, in a village just like you would imagine, with thatch roofs. The floor is made of a kind of bark they would peel off a tree and crack and lay it out flat. And it covered the floor pretty quickly, but to lay on it or sit on it wasn't the same. It was hard, it was rippled, and they didn't have mattresses. I'll never forget when my stuff did not arrive from the United States for 10.5 months. Lived in a house without anything but some foam pads on the floor. And they had packed a couple of our boxes in scraps of carpet, just ends of carpeting for padding. And one of the ladies that had been trying to teach me Spanish, because I was a very slow learner, when we were unpacking it, she saw that carpet, she looked at me and she said, "Is this where you sleep?" And I thought, oh my word, she thought that carpet was so soft on the floor, and you just don't realize how much you have. But back to Ramon. I thought we ought to stay with the dugout canoe theme also, because he got in trouble with the dugout canoe, and he did not follow the word of obeying what his mother and father said. But I got to tell you what these dugout canoes look like, because they were so advanced in the Peruvian jungles that they didn't have paddles on a lot of their canoes. Anybody ever heard of a Briggs & Stratton motor? It's on most of your lawnmowers. I think 90% of those motors leave Wisconsin and go to the jungle of Peru, because they take a Briggs & Stratton engine and they put a propeller on it. But the propeller is on the end of a steel rod about 6 feet long. And then they weld another rod to the top of it so they can steer, and they have the engine on a pivot point because there's so much junk in the Amazon River, in the headwaters of the Amazon. We were on the Ucayali River, that they can lift it up. They just push down on the lever, the propeller comes up out of the water, and they don't mess up their propeller that's very precious. And they don't use very big propellers. They don't go very fast. They're all dugouts. They have about 2 inches of freeboard, And you see guys out there standing in them, throwing fishing nets, and their balance is amazing. Ramon had been told in his little village in Mebati not to mess with the motor. When they weren't using their canoes and they were pulled up to the bank, they would take the propeller, lift it out of the water, and put a rope around the steering handle to hold it up out of the water so the current wouldn't catch it and flip the boat around. But Ramon's dad had the best canoe in all of Mebati. And Ramon one day decided, when he was with a few of his friends, that they were getting really bored just slipping down the mud into the river and trying to catch some fish and trying to deal with the piranha and all the stuff in the water. And he decided he was going to show his friends how tough he was and that he could drive his dad's canoe. They called them a pecky-peck because the motors kind of went peck, 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 up and down the river all the time. So he got in the pecky-peck and he undid the rope. And he was showing him he could pull the cord to start it, and as he did, his hand slipped. And the propeller dropped into the water, and it caught in the current. The current is unbelievable. Let me just tell you, the one time I crossed the headwaters of the Amazon to the other side, they turned the boat upriver. And we barely ended it where we wanted to go straight across to the other side, because the current just moves incredibly hard. It caught this long post, 3 feet long, that he would ordinarily steer with, and it sliced his arm open from his elbow to his wrist. It laid him open. There are no telephones, there were no cell phones, there were no radios. Now, in a few of the villages where we had an Adventist worker, they had two-way radios, a sideband radio, and frequency that went to the East Peru Mission office. And then because we had the airplanes, it was also in my kitchen. So you could hear when your husband calls in, Mayday, Mayday, I'm going down. Which is not a nice thing to hear, but that's another story for another day. They couldn't get to a radio to call without getting back on the river. And what would have been a 15-minute flight in one of our mission planes took 3 days. To get to a village where they could get on the sideband radio and call into the mission and say, can you please send the plane? Because everything they tried for Ramon's arm was not working. They put the mud on it, like they always do put mud on wounds. They wrapped it in the leaves. There was a special leaf that they would collect. They would take an old glass Coke bottle or oil bottle or a whiskey bottle or whatever they had glass, and they would mash those leaves up till it made a stinky black paste, and they would rub that on. And it really helped the problem I had with some contact dermatitis. I don't know what it was, but it really worked. It smelled terrible. But it didn't help this. And pretty soon his arm was turning black. And he had red streaks going up his arm. And his fingers were swollen the size of sausages. And he couldn't use it, and he was in constant pain. Ramon was not feeling quite so cocky at this point. And they didn't know any alternative other than to try to get to a radio to call for the mission plane.